and all of that. So it's a big vector for performance issues because they can get pretty hairy. So when I talk about layouts, I like to start by talking about just general design. So our first bullet point here. And what I mean by general design is really taking care in how you design your layouts, how you set them up, and what you are showing to the end user. So I'll start by saying to keep your actual layouts focused. And this is pretty, I don't know, it's pretty intuitive when you think about it. If you've got a layout with 700 objects, that's obviously going to load slower than a layout with 100 objects. That's really, and that's not like it's not like a one-to-one necessarily. I don't know what kind of optimizations FileMaker is doing in the background to maybe ease some of that performance pain, but it's definitely going to have some impact at some level. So keeping your layouts kind of focused towards the task at hand, and that's good UI design as well, or UX design, because people aren't really going to be able to take huge amounts of information all at the same time and kind of deal with those. So one way to handle that would be to split up your modules into kind of sub modules. So you might have like a customers module, and then you might have submenus for more targeted pieces of that customer. So you might have a different layout to show activities associated with that customer, or communications associated with that customer. You might have a different layout to show possible associations with that customer. Who else is this customer connected to? And splitting those up into two different layouts will obviously ease the amount of work that FileMaker has to do to serve that content to your user, and will obviously therefore impact performance. And you can obviously also keep your found sets focused as well. So try to avoid giving the user 10,000 records to scroll through at a time. Rather design a path that puts them into a smaller found set, so they don't get into a situation where they're endlessly scrolling and it's constantly pausing and trying to download those records and stuttering and kind of continuing on. A lot of this is, when it comes to layout design, it's almost more, it's a little bit more of kind of making people think it's faster than actually making anything faster. But there's definitely some things you can do on a fundamental level to reduce the amount of time that your layout is going to load. The next one that I'm going to talk about here is images and icons is a really big one. Obviously, an image, a logo is a really great addition to a system. You get to show, brand the system, or you can put like stock photos in there in certain scenarios to make things look nice. But you really have to pay attention to the size of that file, because obviously when somebody opens up that layout, they're going to have to download that file. So if it's a 5 megabyte image, it's going to impact performance. It's going to take a little bit longer to actually load that up. And again, I'm sure FileMaker is caching, and they've got their own set of like optimization things that they're doing in the background to kind of do as much for you as possible, but you've got to meet them halfway there to kind of ensure that your system stays performant. And of course, I think they can really only cache so much. So in your FileMaker Pro settings, there is a specific cache setting under the memory. Obviously the file cache is limited to 128 megabytes. So, again, I'm not sure exactly what that necessarily includes, if that includes all assets related to the file or what, but yeah, and obviously you can adjust this up and down depending on your system availability, but by default, your users are not going to go in there. They're pretty much never going to go in there. So it's something you need to kind of keep in mind is the size of your assets. Icons are also another big part of it. Obviously, everybody loves using little icons to make your system, a little bit more user-friendly. And I think it's easy to go to, like a icon aggregation service and download, PNG files or JPEG files and use those. But uh, typically, you're going to have better performance if you try to find icons that are SVG files. So that stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. And one site you can use for SVGs would be like, I don't know if you've ever heard of Ionic, but it's like a front end framework kind of thing. But they have icons that are MIT licensed, so it's a really liberal license for you to use. And they give you an SVG format that FileMaker can actually deal with. And there's kind of two major benefits with using SVG icons. The first being they're really small. They're less like an edited image, and they're more like a set of text instructions that FileMaker can interpret and use to display that image. So what that means is that no matter what size you show this icon at, the size of the file doesn't really change, which is huge, because it means that you can have a 128 point icon and you don't have to deal with the overhead that a 128 point image would typically come with. It's still that same small, nice sized file. And then obviously with SVG, if you're not already aware, you can also do things like style the color, do the fill color for the icon and change those, especially with different states. So a lot easier to manage. I think if you're not using SVG icons, you should definitely consider that for your future development for a lot of reasons, but performance is definitely up there. It's also important when you're talking about layouts to think about themes. And when I say themes, I'm talking about this guy over here in the appearance tab at the inspector. You pretty much always want to have a theme for your file, and you pretty much want to make sure that your objects are saved styles within that theme. So you can see this is an example of a style that is not saved. So it's got the red icon there. And what that implies is that FileMaker has to generate, so at the behind the scenes here, everything here is CSS. So it's all a set of rules for each object that tell FileMaker what that object should look like. So when you've got this little red icon here, what that means is that FileMaker has to generate an entirely separate rule for that object. So it's physically creating more content for the client to download. And every time you have one of those red objects, it's another rule that you've got to deal with. So instead, what you want to do is you want to save changes to that style and make sure that each one of those is saved. And what that does is if it's a save style, each one of these objects can reference that style, and it only has to essentially include that rule once, rather than if you say have like 800 objects on your layout, and every single one of those is using their own unique styles, their own local styles is what they refer to them as. Then that's 800 individual rules that FileMaker has to download for styling, along with obviously everything else. And it's not, and it has the potential to be, more of an issue, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's always usually the #1 performance killer. It's just something that you want to keep in mind and plan for. It's just better just to keep that as optimized as you can right up front. And then obviously, if something doesn't quite fit in that default style, you can always create a new style for that object, and then that's creating another rule, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. Yeah, so other kind of special cases, and this is really more of a WebDirect thing, and the theme stuff is especially important on WebDirect, but tab controls are on WebDirect a much more complicated object than something like slide panels are. This is one of those things where it's like, if you're not familiar with setting up views or using slide controls as like a tab control, if you're not already familiar with that kind of setup, then this is, it's not that important. Tab controls are still fine and they still work well and they're still performant enough. But if you are comfortable with using slide controls in that way as almost a replacement for tab controls, then there's almost no reason to go back to tab controls because you get all of the benefits of tab controls in terms of siloing your data and creating separate subviews within your layout with increased flexibility. And slide controls themselves are they're a much simpler object, especially as it relates to WebDirect for FileMaker to render. So it's a special case, but I feel like it's worth mentioning that it could potentially save you a second of whatever of time and impact your performance. Maybe not noticeably, but moving on here, we'll talk a little bit about FileMaker Server. So with FileMaker Server, there's kind of a few things that I'm gonna touch on. The first one is hard drive, and I mean, it kind of depends on what you're doing. It depends on the circumstances, but solid state drives can have a huge impact on your performance, your application's performance. Solid state drives are just they can do reads and writes significantly faster than the old platter hard drives. So, with something like FileMaker, which is a database, which is read and write heavy, it's going to have a considerable impact, potentially. Yeah, again, it really it depends a little bit on what you're doing, but I think in most cases that's gonna have an impact of some kind. So would definitely recommend evaluating that. I would also, when it comes to hard drives, I would really recommend making sure that your disk space doesn't get critically low. The way FileMaker Server cache works is it can detect when you are getting critically low, and it can start dumping the cache out as to help make room for for data. And if that happens, obviously you're going to be hurting your performance. There's that concept of caching. So caching being like, it will take some data that you've just looked at and it will store it so that if in the future you ask for that same data, again, it has it at the ready. It can just give it right over to you. It doesn't have to go and find it and spend those extra processor cycles to look for it. It can just immediately hand it right over to you. So if your disk space is critically low and it dumps that cache, that means that every operation that a user looks for or requests from the server, it has to physically compute whatever it needs to compute. It's not ready for it to just hand over. So it can have a serious impact on your performance. And that goes for the client as well. So if you've got one client that has some performance issues and nobody else is complaining about it, you might want to check their hard drive and see if maybe it's getting critically low. I think FileMaker recommends like 20% capacity. So you should have 20% disk space free at all times at the minimum, basically. If you exceed that 20%, it's time to start looking at increasing your drive space. Processor is also going to have a pretty big impact. FileMaker server processes are pretty compartmentalized. So you've got like the script engine and the data API and the database server and the web publishing engine. All of those are separate individual discrete processes, which means that if you have like a dual core or a quad core processor, FileMaker is able to delegate those individual processes to their own, to different cores, and that could have obviously a great impact on your system speed, your performance. FileMaker server is really going to benefit from, if you're at a dual core and you're having performance issues, it may be worthwhile to considering upgrading to a quad core. And obviously, all of this is totally situational. I think you've got to look at the performance of the server. I think you've got to take a look at exactly what's going on. If your system is slow and FileMaker server is not using, uh, anywhere near all of the current CPU cores that you have, that's probably not the bottleneck. All of this, as we talk about it, it's always going to be that there's some bottleneck that once you increase the capacity there, it's going to hit the next bottleneck. And, at a certain point, that bottleneck is just going to be like, the end user's internet speed or something like that you can't really control. So that's really what all this is about, is kind of making sure that FileMaker server is working optimally and eliminating bottlenecks as you come across them. Memory is another potential bottleneck. And I know I already mentioned cache a little bit with the hard drive, but cache kind of goes hand in hand with this. It really, the memory depends on the size of your database. If you've got a really tiny database, obviously, that's going to require less memory. By default, I can't remember what FileMaker server sets it at, but it sets it at a pretty low, like your cache at a pretty low limit. If you ever want to, you can, one moment here. Pull up a note so I can show this command. I guess I can do it in actual terminal here. So there is a command that you can use on the server to change your cache, and it is this. It's fms admin set server config, and then cache size equals, and then it's going to take a value in megabytes. So that may be another thing to look at if you've got performance issues and your server's not using anywhere near the memory that you've got, and you can't quite identify any other bottlenecks. I mean, it could be you just need to increase the size of your cache, and some of this really depends on what you are, what your users are doing. If you've got, like, I don't know, hundreds of databases, but they're all really infrequently used, then cache may not help all that much, because things are not going to be frequently reaccessed. So that cache is not always going to be necessarily hit all the time. But if you've got one system and it's the same data is going to be brought out day after day, then cache is going to have huge implications. Obviously, the more memory that you have, the higher your cache can be. And they say that you're shooting for like 100% cache hit. You want the cache to be hit as often as possible. So definitely a good thing to look for there. WebDirect considerations. WebDirect is a really intensive process, and it makes sense because you're basically taking your system and you are generating a website out of it. So it's bound to be pretty intensive. So if you've got a lot of WebDirect users, I would highly recommend looking into potentially splitting that out into a multiple machine deployment. And what that looks like is you would have FileMaker server, and it's hosting off the databases, but then you would also have one or more machines acting as worker machines that are there to handle all the web publishing engine kind of tasks. So it's not super complicated to set up. It's really more of a resource thing than anything else. But if you've got tons of WebDirect users and you're running into performance problems and it's prohibitive to upgrade that machine any further, it may be worthwhile to go ahead and just spin up some worker machines and handle it that way. That could both obviously reduce the load for your web users, but then it would also, for your straight FileMaker users, that would free up a lot of resources on the main database server because the main database server doesn't have to also worry about the web people as well. So it's kind of just increasing the general resources available for everybody involved, which is obviously a good thing when it comes to dealing with performance like this. And just to make sure here, Marshall, you see the PowerPoint up here right now, right?
Sure do. Yep.
Great. All right.
Little comp check. Ryan, let's take just a second. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? We've got just unmute yourself, yell it out if you've got anything for Ryan up to this point. Lovely, lovely. Carry on, sir.
Great, thanks. So logging is also going to be a super important part of just determining where you may be having issues. FileMaker server has a neat feature called top call statistics, and it's really easy to enable. You just pop into your, I can load it up here real quick, give me one moment. But you just pop into your server and there's a section with a couple of logs, and one of those is top call stats. And top call stats will basically show you for a interval period, like a collection period, it will show you the 25 most expensive calls that your system has processed. This could be like pretty much any process. It could be like, they ran this script and this script is doing some really intensive things and it is, so this is going to be 18, by the way, but I'll just quickly show it. It's right here, this top call statistics function under the configuration and logging. I'm pretty sure that's still the same on 19. I don't believe that's changed. But I'll disable that again here because it does impact performance. So you're probably only going to enable this for the purposes of you are having an issue and you want to see what's up. But it'll give you those top 25, and you can. I think initially it's kind of hard to totally decipher exactly what's going on there. Like it uses like IDs and I don't know, other stuff to refer to layouts and scripts and things like that. But there's tools like FM Perception, and I'm sure there's others that will take that log file and take like a DDR and actually parse it out and process it and put it into a more meaningful format. So you can use that to kind of catch issues that people aren't even complaining about yet. You could say, let me run this on a weekly basis and just see what the top 25 most expensive calls are for a certain period. And then, just look into them, just see if there's anything that you could do in a little bit more of a performant way or deal with it a little bit better so that people aren't, beachballing or wheel spinning or whatever they're using these days. And then there's also things just like general performance monitoring, like I think with 18, they released, the Zabbix monitoring, which is a nice little monitoring tool you can use to monitor multiple FileMaker servers. Probably not something that you're going to really need if you're just dealing with one server, but if you've got a more complicated setup, it could be worthwhile looking into. And I mean, yeah. So moving on here, assuming there's no more questions on the server side of things. We'll move on to some development techniques, which I think is kind of, I don't know, it's the big one for me because I feel like so much of what we do on the development side can get us into trouble And I feel like it's a lot harder to handle this side of it than it is on the hardware side. Like, if it is a hardware issue, if the bottleneck truly is just hardware, you upgrade the AWS instance, or you do whatever. You actually upgrade your physical machine, and you're kind of done. It's a lot less. There's a lot less effort that goes into that than it does on the hardware side, in I think most cases. Um, so we'll start by talking about fields, and a couple of things that you can do to make sure that from a field standpoint, you're staying performant. And I think kind of the number one is to make sure that you're always using indexing whenever possible. And this is, FileMaker makes this super easy because it by default automatically indexes your fields for you. So it's got this option here, automatically create indexes as needed. And what the index does is it generates it in the background as you use your system. It generates a alphabetically sorted unique list of entries in that specific field. And there's actually two types of indexes. There's minimal and there's all. Minimal would be the first 100. I think it's like 100, maybe like 120. It's the first like 100 or so characters that appear within that field. So you can see like the minimal index would look something like this for this field. Right, and it's alphabetically sorted. It's a unique listing. It's the first 100 characters. If we exceed that 100-ish characters, then obviously that section would not be necessarily indexed. And then there's the full indexed, which is the same thing. It's an alphabetically unique, alphabetically sorted unique list of words that appear in that field. But rather than being the first 100 characters, it's each individual word. You kind of think of this as like a map. Like, when FileMaker looks to the index and it looks for the word Nemo, what you don't see here is that it has its own internal mapping of like where Nemo appears in this field in the system. So what that implies is that it makes it much faster to find. Like I can, FileMaker can look at this list and evaluate it for the word Nemo, and then find obviously the corresponding records that it internally references for it way faster than it would be able to evaluate each individual record to determine whether or not the word Nemo appears there. So indexing is going to be huge from a find perspective, and I mean, from a calculation perspective as well. I think a big hit that people kind of get hit with when they first start developing in FileMaker is, they use these calculations that are unstored. So, and sometimes you have to, right? Like if I want to get the most recent donation date for this person, one way to do that would be to say last donation date, create a calculation, and reference my related donation field, and do something like the max of that. And I've got myself an unstored calculation field. So not in any way ideal. But if I were a total beginner, I would have no way of really knowing that. And the biggest problem with this is obviously every time that you need this data, FileMaker has to generate it on the fly. And this might be pretty quick because I'm on a local system, it's not hosted or anything. And this is another trap that people will get into is, with 500 records, and obviously more donations, but 500 records on a local system, that's pretty snappy, right? But if I were to add, 50,000 more records and I were to host this system up on the web and repeat that process, that find would be significantly slower because it's got to jump through each one of these records. It has to look at all donation records and find the most recent date out of all of those, and then it has to determine whether or not that's going to be included in the found set and has to repeat that process 50,000 times. So it's like, yeah, of course it's going to be slow. In these situations where maybe you do need the last donation date displayed, what I'll sometimes do is I'll make this just a regular date field, and I'll create scripts that will, on a regular basis, update this field with the stored value. So I might have like scheduled updates or something. I might have something that goes through every person record on a nightly basis, or, and it obviously depends on your circumstances. And it may be something that you need to do every like 15 minutes, or it may be something that you need to do every 2 weeks. Obviously, the frequency is going to depend on what you're doing. But then you can say if if that doesn't equal that, you can then update it with the most current value. You can essentially do your own, effectively caching of that data. And that's a really nice way to kind of get, that aggregate data without sacrificing the performance and your user's patience. So now if I run this guy, it'll go through and it'll do that, which is still fairly quick, obviously on my local system here, but 50,000 records, hosted environment might take a little bit longer. Now we've got that same information, but it's in a stored and indexed field, which means that it's going to be much faster for FileMaker to find and work with. And obviously, if I throw this into a list view, that's going to be a lot easier for FileMaker as well to display that that stored value versus something that has to reach out and find 300 donations every time that it has to reference it.
But it's definitely use case driven.
Totally.
Like,
yeah.
That might not, yeah. And the other thing that kind of jumped out at me, when would you use minimum versus all? What kind of use case would you have one to the other?
Yeah, so I mean, usually you really only have to worry about which one you're using when you get up to very large systems. So if your record count, I don't know what the number would be, but let's call it 500,000. Your record count reaches 500,000, then you need to start paying attention to the amount of space that your index is, because that's the downside is indexes obviously increase performance, but at the cost of storage.
Right.
So if you've got 500,000 records, you may not want to use that full word index for every last field in your system. It may be some of these don't need to be indexed at all, or maybe some of them only need that minimal index. But for, I would say, the vast majority of FileMaker systems out there, you're going to be fine just letting FileMaker manage it on its own, because it's going to determine based on what you've searched for in that field whether or not it needs to create a minimal or a full index. And if it initially you only need the minimal, and then later you do something that requires a full index, it will manage that all on its own. You don't have to really dig into that process at all.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but really great question. I think I definitely did not mention the downsides of indexing, which again, it's going to be big systems, but it's totally going to play a role once you get to that point.
So what would you do then? Kind of pick and choose through your fields of the fields that you're searching on heavily, you would full index them, and fields that you're not really doing a whole lot with, you would minimum or potentially even none?
Yeah, so I mean, like if a field is never going to have more than 100 characters, or you don't really need to search in the middle of it, I would keep it minimal indexing. If you don't need to search on that field ever, it's purely just for the purposes of displaying to the end user, and it's never found, used in a find, then, or a relationship is the other big one, then it would be something that would, maybe I don't index it at all. So it's really just kind of evaluating how you're using that field and whether you need to search for a specific word in the middle, or if you're always going to be searching from kind of the beginning, and kind of handling it that way. So like a first name, you would probably be totally fine with a minimal index in almost all cases. But a notes field would be kind of useless without that full index, because not being able to search for this word in the middle of these notes makes it unreliable, and it makes it seem like that the find is not trustworthy.
Gotcha. Ooh, that's kind of interesting. Like that might be why you don't find some stuff in big notes, right? Because yeah, oh, it's interesting. All right.
So kind of right along those same lines, summary fields. Honestly, I mean, I would say in a lot of cases, I'm kind of shying away from summary fields, and maybe doing my own like on the fly calculations or stored values or whatever. But you know, if you've got to use summary fields, make sure that you're using them very consciously. Like I wouldn't just throw them on a list view that is for end users, you know, consumption, because as soon as they go to that list view and they try to load up 10,000 records, FileMaker is not going to give you a choice. It's going to try to calculate, you know, if you're doing a sum, it's going to try to calculate the sum of all 10,000 of whatever field, and calculate that, and you're going to wait for it, and you don't have an option, which is never a good experience for I think literally anybody in the world. You know, either offload that processing to like a server-side schedule, kind of like what we discussed with the unstored calculations, or I've heard of some people doing like, you know, they'll do like kind of like queries in the background to, you know, set a global variable with effectively that same summary value. I think it's something you got to experiment around with it. Make sure that you're testing with the kind of data that you expect to be in the system when it goes live, and in a similar environment to when it goes live. So if that means a hosted WAN environment, make sure that you're dealing with it that way. Like, you know, you don't want to develop something totally locally and then deploy it to AWS and then try to expect everybody to have the same exact experience as you did locally, because those are two very different environments. You're going to have very different results.
Right.
I would also be mindful of auto enter calculations. And this one's not as big of a deal, but you know, so obviously you can do like, I'll change this one just for kicks. Not that I actually would, but I'll change this full name one to an auto enter calculation. I love that it saves it. That's always nice. So with the auto enter calculation, obviously anytime the first name or the last name field get updated, this calculation is going to re-trigger, which is like great, absolutely fantastic in most cases. But I would also say that, you know, if you are using that too heavily, it can make committing a record a slower process, because that means that obviously everything that touches the field that you modified, as far as an auto enter calculation goes, needs to recalculate. And if those are really expensive calculations, it can mean that they're beachballing, you know, every time they make any edit to that field. So it can kind of, it can make it feel like you've got like these traps in your system. Like, yeah, if you modify this field, you're going to have to wait for 5 seconds and then it'll finally save. And again, that's not a great experience. It's just something that you want to kind of keep in mind. And it is obviously, it's, you know, it seems like the better alternative from like an unstored calculation, because it's still an indexed field. Like you still have that index that you can kind of use for finds and all that. But it's just on the commit level, it can really have some impacts that are less than ideal. Also important to note that all fields of a record get uploaded and downloaded as a single unit, which means that if you display, like if I were just to display this first name field, all this other data would get downloaded regardless whether or not it's actually displayed. And the same thing with getting uploaded. Like, you know, if I modify this, it's got to upload everything back up to the server in order to set that record. So What that implies is that you typically want to avoid having tables that are hundreds and hundreds of fields large, with an exception, which I'll touch on in a bit. But what they recommend is that you instead narrow those tables, and we've done this before for clients. I think we were approached some years back. I think Mike had to work with these folks to deal with a really complicated form that they were using in WebDirect, super slow, with multiple pages, and every time they loaded up a page, it would take forever to actually load. So he worked with them to narrow those tables, so reduce the amount of fields in the main table, and split it off into one-to-one relationships. So let's say that each page would be its own set of fields, and each one of those would be its own table, which allows FileMaker server or FileMaker to download less data for each page, and obviously kind of delay that process as they progress through the form. So that's going to be huge. If you do have that kind of monster table situation going on there, you should really evaluate, what can I logically break up into a one-to-one relationship, and reduce the amount that FileMaker server has to download every time I look at this first name field. And again, upload every time I update the first name field. And there's an exception there, which I mentioned, which is empty fields have no impact on the record size at all. FileMaker does like this tree thing. So whether or not a field, if a field doesn't have data, it just doesn't exist in the tree. So it never gets evaluated in that process, basically. So it's kind of like if you've got hundreds of fields, but 99% of them are always empty, you're really not going to see a performance impact for breaking that into narrow tables, because it's just not, that's not where the work is coming from. It's not coming from record size with that many empty fields. That can have implications for things like virtual lists too, and we're kind of getting into even more advanced topics here with this, but there's kind of two ways to do virtual lists. You can get like a list of IDs and then use those IDs to refer to records, right, related records, or you can gather all the data that you need into a virtual list and then parse it all out into something, a list within your system. And that first method, obviously, it's fine if you're not dealing with a lot of data, but if you are, or if you're dealing with very large records, then every time you reference that data, FileMaker has to download all that. So I think we just worked with one of our developers pretty recently to change a virtual list that they were using that was super slow, from referencing related data to just collecting everything that it needed when it was building that virtual list. And the performance improvement was stark. It was really nice. So next up, I want to talk about execute SQL a little bit. It's just a quick one. It's something that I get bitten by like once every 6 months. So I feel like I need to talk about it. If you run a select query with execute SQL against a table that has a record open in your session, it's going to crawl. It's going to absolutely crawl. So what that means is, like, if I'm modifying this person record and I've got something in the background that runs a query against the person table, that is going to be super slow. And there's just nothing you can really do about that except, not run that query until after this record is committed, or run the query in a different way, not using execute SQL, like, open up a new window in the background and do the find there and then come back, or use the execute data API, even better these days. But execute SQL specifically, that bites me, like I said, at least once every 6 months. So keep that in mind. A couple other items here. Perform script on server is fantastic. So if you're not familiar with it, perform script on server is a script step, looks like this, that allows you to run your script, any script that you call, on the server. And you can wait for it to complete and return back to this script to continue on, or you can turn off that wait for completion and kind of get that asynchronous loading going on, which could be, really nice to just kind of like, take this data and go process this import or whatever. But I'll just warn that you should kind of use it sparingly. I guess it's more about using it in the right circumstances. So I think like processing an import is like great. I wouldn't have it run a perform script on the server to like I don't know, like update, like every time I update this record, kick that off, or to send an email or anything like that. Anything like really frequently caused by user interaction, because perform script on server has its own overhead. So every time you kick off a PSOS session on the server, FileMaker server has to boot up like a headless FileMaker Pro client and open the database and download all the tables and all the relationships, and has to do a whole bunch of like prep work to even get to the point of running your script. And then it has to run your script. So if you've got tons of PSOS sessions running all the time for all hours of the day, it's going to use a lot of resources on the server. And that could, have trickle down impacts into other areas of the system because those resources aren't available for, other tasks because they're busy running PSOS. So in general, I do like it, but I feel like it's got to be like, I'm about to process a very large task and I want it done on the server. I don't think it should be, in general, something that you run for I feel like, again, like sending an email would be a less than ideal way to use that.
And Ryan, that's completely different than a scheduled script on a server, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly. So a scheduled script is going to run, as the name implies, on a regular basis every day or hour or week that you tell it to run. PSOS is going to be something that is user initiated. So they like click a button here, and as part of that script that button is tied to, you may then call perform script on server, which
Gotcha.
that script and then runs it on the server. And you're limited to all the same script steps available to you in terms of compatibility that the server scheduled ones are. So it's a really similar process. It's just about like, essentially what executes it. Server-side schedules are going to be executed by the server. PSOS is going to be executed by the user. So as an alternative to PSOS, and again, it's all super situation dependent. You might want to think about using work queues instead. So that would be, you generate a record in a queue that represents a task that the system should do. And then you've got a server-side schedule that is running on a regular basis and looking at that queue and performing those tasks as they appear and processing them and then exiting. So that avoids, because obviously, if you've got, kind of going back to emails, if you've got 100 people sending emails out of the system, opening up 100 PSOS sessions on the server would be excessive. It would be a waste of resources. Whereas if you've got 100 people that are creating a record through whatever action in a queue table, then you've got one server-side schedule that's going through and just sending an email out. I mean, you're accomplishing the same task, probably, I don't know, probably quicker with with a tenth of the resources. So I think, or excuse me, 100th of the resources, potentially. So I think that kind of queue system, and again, it kind of depends on the context, depends on what you're doing, but that's a really great design pattern as an alternative for all of this, for PSOS. And that's all I really came up with here. So
Wow, nice glide path right to the right right to the end there. That's sweet. Well, that was a lot to chew on. Great job, man. Uh, you're kind of you're I've told you this before. You're kind of the reason that I came up with this office hours because it's almost like watching Bob Ross go, you know, like, oh, he's making a painting. Oh, I understand that. And I would say my skill level of FileMaker is probably rookie at best. You know, I'm just sitting here thinking of some of the things that I've done that have been completely, you know, flying in the face of what you got. So I do see that Mike has been answering some questions in the chat. If you can bring it up, you can follow along over there. Um, the other thing, you know, we're getting mighty shy on topics. You know, every Monday we have an all hands meeting, and that's the first question I ask everybody is, hey, what can we do? Um, this I think is really good. You know, I don't want to turn this into an ad by any stretch of the imagination, but if you are interested in Ryan taking a look at your system and you know, evaluating, giving you some ideas, things like that, it's a perfect opportunity for a coaching session. We charge 170 an hour. Just throw something to answers at gomainspring.com. We can get you set up. But you know, I was just thinking that it might be worthwhile, Ryan, for you to spend some time with some folks that really potentially are having performance issues, or they want to glean some better performance. The other thing that you know, I've always been excited about is layout and design, and we've started doing this internally in Mainspring, where Ryan will take a solution and tear it apart. You know, he's got some really good design ideas and things structurally to make FileMaker look really good. And we've done a lot of group and a lot of one-on-one, where one of our developers will give Brian something, he'll evaluate it, and then get back to them. Um, if you're interested in that, you know, answers at gomainspring.com.